So I think it's good we start with Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Malik yawm al-Din. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'een. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. Sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim ghayri al-maghdubi alayhim wa ad-dallin. Sadaqallahu al-aliyyul azim. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعن الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين آمين يا رب العالمين. أما بعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So this is part 29 of our ongoing series of discussions on the book attributed to Imam Sadiq entitled Misbah ash-Sharia, or the Lantern of the Path. As I say at the start of each of these sessions, and sessions in all of our other series, there is a requirement for anyone consuming this to, at the very least, take a cursory look at previous sessions. Though I would say studying them properly is far more beneficial, as the nature of this subject matter requires a build-up of understanding in a step-by-step manner. Since each session builds on the one that came before, it is crucial that the previous sessions are actually studied. Like I said, at least in a cursory manner, though I would strongly recommend that they're studied fully so as to be more beneficial. And this is so we can try to ensure that misunderstandings, confusions, invalid assumptions, and such do not ensue. And this also ensures that we can garner more understanding from each session. Nevertheless, we do have a short recap, so if I can get a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, we can proceed.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So in the previous session, we did not merely remember the martyrs of Karbala. We bore witness to those whom God appointed to survive. Their survival was not passive, it was purposeful, it was sacred. We explored how Sayyidah Zaynab al-Kubra, peace and blessings be upon her, emerged as the living proof that divine authority is not limited to bloodline or position, but rather is embodied in insight, endurance, and absolute loyalty to God. She did not carry her brother's message as a relic, she carried it as a revolution. In the courts of Kufa and Damascus, her words pierced the thrones. Her veil became a banner of resistance. Her sermons, as noted by scholars such as the martyr Ayatollah Murtada Mutahhari, preserved the soul of Ashura when the battlefield had gone quiet. Beside her stood Imam Zayn al-Abidin, peace and blessings be upon him, the fourth Imam of the Ahlul Bayt, shackled, sick, yet unbroken. Though denied the sword, he wielded the truth. Though bound in chains, he carried the mantle of Wilayah. And though surrounded by mockery and despotism, he refused to bow. His sermons, his silence, and his supplications each served as vessels of divine protest and guidance. Together they became the messengers of Karbala, guardians of the divine trust, preserving the truth of Imam Husayn not through might, but through remembrance, resistance, and unbreakable faith. And now in this session, we continue our journey to understand the Imam who ruled without a throne, to follow the path of Imam Sajjad, peace and blessings be upon him, not in chains, but in du'a, to witness how the fire of Ashura became the light of divine reform. We continue in the name of the Lord of the oppressed and the avenger of every martyr's blood. Please give me a salawat and we proceed.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So, to speak of Imam Zayn al-Abidin, peace and blessings be upon him, is to stand before a mountain veiled in clouds. His greatness is clear to those who seek it, yet misunderstood by many who claim to know him. In the public imagination, he is reduced to titles like as-Sajjad, the one who prostrates, or the sick one of Karbala, as though his entire life was spent only in tearful worship and passive isolation. Yet such portrayals betray a profound ignorance of his reality. His brief illness on the day of Ashura was divinely ordained. It was not a sign of frailty, but a means to preserve him for the burden of Imamah that lay ahead. After the martyrdom of his father, Imam Husayn, peace and blessings be upon him, he would carry the trust of Wilayah through the most oppressive and spiritually suffocating period of Islamic history. This reductionist view that he lived a life of quiet worship with no political engagement is not just incorrect, it is dangerous. It obscures the Imam's strategic leadership, his deep engagement with society, and the spiritual resistance he embodied. In Quran, in Surah al-Sajjad, the chapter of prostration, the 32nd chapter of Quran, verse 24, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, "And we made from among them leaders, guided by our command, when they were patient and had certainty in our signs." Imam Sajjad's silence was not apathy. It was divine leadership clothed in forbearance. So now let us try and understand the motive. The life of any individual, particularly a divinely appointed Imam, cannot be understood by isolated incidents. A character cannot be assessed by a series of disconnected events. It must be understood in light of the central motive that drives every act, every silence, every tear, and every word. The same applies to Imam Sajjad. If one isolates his du'a, or his interactions, or his political stances without understanding the overarching purpose of his imamah, one will fall into misinterpretation. That motive, as evidenced by the lives of the Imams before him, was to restore the authentic Islamic order, an order rooted in the Quran, in Tawheed, in justice, and Wilayah, in divine guardianship. This was not a passive teaching mission. It was a struggle, a strategic and spiritual movement to prepare the grounds for an Islamic government that mirrored the Prophet's vision. He was the legacy that began in chains. With the martyrdom of Imam Husayn on the 10th of Muharram, 61 years after Hijrah, the mantle of Imamah fell upon Imam Sajjad. His era of leadership began not in a mosque, but in chains, not surrounded by students, but shackled before tyrants, not at the head of an army, but in the ruins of Karbala. He would live for 35 years after that tragedy, under constant threat from the Umayyad dynasty, especially during the reign of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. Yet throughout this period, every sermon, every letter, every supplication, and every silence was a calculated step towards reviving the Ummah's spiritual and political integrity. His famous confrontation with Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad in Kufa and then Yazid in Damascus exemplified extraordinary courage. Yet this outward defiance was balanced by a profound strategic subtlety in Medina, where his calm demeanor disguised the underground currents of resistance. He was continuing the strategy of the earlier Imams. Imam Sajjad was not pursuing a new path. He was continuing a divinely revealed strategy initiated by Imam Ali and developed further by Imam Hassan and Imam Husayn, peace and blessings be upon them all. This strategy was long-term and multifaceted, to preserve the core of the Muslim Ummah, purify its beliefs, build a vanguard of the faithful, and ultimately re-establish divine rule when conditions permitted. After the peace treaty of Imam Hassan in 40 AH, the Ahl al-Bayt focused on ideological groundwork. They taught, they trained, they wrote, and they mobilized. Imam Husayn continued this approach until conditions necessitated a revolution. Karbala, while a massive sacrifice, was also a clarifying event, exposing the hypocrisy of the ruling elite and reawakening the Ummah's conscience. Had the events of Karbala not occurred, the trajectory laid by Imam Hassan might have resulted in an Islamic government in the hands of Ahlul Bayt. But after the massacre, the path was obstructed, and a new phase of subtle, patient rebuilding was required. This was a task entrusted to Imam Sajjad, a task where he had to rebuild from the ashes. The destruction of the Ahlul Bayt's followers after Karbala, through mass executions, through fear and through co-option, was catastrophic. Yet the Imam did not abandon the cause. He recalibrated. His tools would not be the sword or public mobilization, but they would be supplication, scholarship, and silent resilience. He would train a generation of scholars. He would compose whispered invocations that penetrated stone-hearted rulers. He would condemn injustice through letters, counsel the wayward, and reform through spiritual confrontation. The Imam once remarked, "We do not know what to do with people. If we narrate what we heard from the Messenger of God, they mock us. And if we remain silent, it is a burden we cannot bear." And again, like I say every session, all of the references and citations are in detail in the write-up. I invite everyone to have a look at that. This was the agony of divine truth trapped in a society no longer able to receive it. You then have the issue of the corruption of the scholars, an issue we face in this time as well. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Umayyad era was not just the tyranny of rulers, but the betrayal of scholars. Men who once sat at the feet of Ahlul Bayt were now officials in the courts of despots. Among them was someone named Muhammad ibn Shahab al-Zuhri. He was a jurist who had once been connected to the Imam, but fame and fortune seduced him. In his response, Imam Sajjad wrote a very powerful letter, and this is recorded in Tuhaf al-Uqul, and in fact in the write-up, footnote number 5, you have the entire letter, which I invite everyone to look at. We will go through it, but I invite everyone to take a look. This is a letter that remains a searing indictment of every scholar who sells their soul to oppressive rulers. A quote from this letter. Imam Sajjad writes, "O Muhammad ibn Shahab, have you forgotten that you used to be considered among the best of the people of knowledge and religion? How could you allow yourself to be among the helpers of the oppressors, entering upon them, confirming their lies, and beautifying their ugly deeds, until you have become as though you are no longer part of this Ummah, nor counted among those who uphold its religion?" The Imam reminded him, and every scholar after him, that the true path was not defined by access to places of governance and palaces, but rather it was by alignment with the oppressed and adherence to the true path. Now, some people criticize the Imam for not openly supporting the uprising of Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, or even of leading any uprising himself. But they fail to grasp the fragility of the situation. Had the Imam revealed his alignment with Mukhtar and the revolt had failed, the entire community of the Shia in Medina and the very lineage of the Imams could well have been exterminated. This was not fear. It was divinely sanctioned Taqiyyah, dissimulation, a protective measure to safeguard the greater mission. In Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, the chapter of the cow, second chapter of the Quran, verse 195, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, "And do not throw yourselves into destruction with your own hands." When Muslim ibn Uqba entered Medina, as we discussed last time, and unleashed the Harra massacre, many feared that Imam Sajjad would be one of the first to be targeted, yet he survived. Not through compromise, but through divine strategy. He remained hidden in plain sight, quietly gathering a community of believers. Please give me a salawat and we continue.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So now let us look at rejecting some of the fabricated accounts of Imam Sajjad's humiliation. Some narrations, which are very weak in chain and entirely inconsistent in their tone, suggest that Muslim ibn Uqba humiliated the Imam during the Harra tragedy. But Imam Khamenei says that upon closer examination, these reports contradict both the Imam's dignity and the known strategies of Ahl al-Bayt. Scholars of insight, including the commentators of Bihar al-Anwar, have noted that many of these accounts were fabricated by court historians or biased transmitters. The traditions that present the Imam as being debased or submissive do not align with verified reports of his conduct, nor with the theological role of the Imam as the inheritor of divine authority. The correct understanding is this: the Imam neither confronted recklessly nor surrendered shamefully. He acted with hikmah or divine wisdom, preserving the line of Imamah and protecting the fragile seed of future revival. Now, the regime of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, under which the Imam lived for the majority of his Imamah, was brutal in its oppression and sophisticated in its surveillance. Spies reported on the Imam's private moments. His speech was monitored. Even his household was not free from the eyes of the state. And yet, within that pressure, the Imam built an inner revolution. Through Sahifa al-Sajjadiyyah, he unveiled the most profound treasury of Islamic spirituality. His du'as were not just personal invocations. They were encoded theology, ethics, resistance, and renewal. For example, if you look at Dua 47, Imam Sajjad says, "O God, make me revere you as though I see you. Grant me joy through reverent obedience to you, and do not doom me through disobedience." And in another one of his sayings preserved in Tuhaf al-Uqul, he declared, "Is there no free person who will abandon this fleeting pleasure to those who are attached to it? Verily, there is no price for your souls except paradise, so do not sell them for anything less. For indeed, this world is base and will be left behind by those who forsake it. You are only engaged in actions, so act accordingly." These statements were sermons hidden in supplication, metaphysical calls to resistance, honor, and identity. Imam Sajjad's strategy was long-term. He knew that his role was not to ignite a war of swords, but to rekindle the soul of a defeated and broken Ummah, to restore hope, identity, and theology, so that the next Imam could act with greater clarity and freedom. As Imam Sadiq narrates, after the killing of Husayn, peace and blessings be upon him, the people turned back from the truth except for three: Abu Khalid al-Kabuli, Yahya bin Tawil, and Jabir bin Mut'im. Then the people joined the truth and their numbers increased. This transformation from abandonment to reawakening was due to the Imam's 35 years of tireless struggle. By the time Imam Baqir, peace and blessings be upon him, assumed the Imamah, the ground was once more fertile for theological teaching and jurisprudential consolidation. This is why the Imam, near the end of his life, formally appointed his son, delivering to him a box and a weapon, symbolic of both spiritual knowledge and trust of revolutionary leadership. At last, in the year 95 AH, during the reign of Al-Walid bin Abdul Malik, the Imam was poisoned. His murder was not random, it was calculated. Just as his entire Imamah had been conducted under pressure, surveillance, and sabotage, yet he passed away in tranquility. He had fulfilled the divine task. He had preserved the spiritual legacy of Karbala. He had rebuilt a community of the faithful. He had safeguarded the line of Imamah. He had transmitted the divine trust to the next Imam. And he had written through silent strength the blueprint of sacred resistance. Just as his father was slain in the open with swords, he was slain in silence with poison. Both were martyred for the same cause, the preservation of the divine path. Now, if I can get a loud salawat, we can then begin to look at the aims of the Imam and the foundations for a future government, future Islamic government.
اللهم صل على
اللهم
محمد
صل على محمد
وآل
وآل
محمد.
محمد وعجل فرجه.
So, having established the ground realities surrounding Imam Zayn al-Abidin's Imamah, it becomes essential now to examine the aims that animated his leadership. His life did not unfold aimlessly, nor was it simply a reactive series of responses to the oppression of his era. Rather, the Imam undertook a systemic and forward-looking program rooted in divine insight. In this portion of the Majlis, we will first outline the three central aims that governed his actions, and then examine the smaller strategic undertakings that supported them. These aims taken together reveal that the Imam was not retreating from politics. He was, in fact, preparing the foundation of an Islamic order in the only way possible under such suffocating conditions. So, first of all, let's look at this idea of a delayed victory and divine timing. It is actually essential to begin with a very pivotal hadith narrated by Imam Sadiq, wherein he says that God had originally decreed that an Islamic government led by the Ahlul Bayt would manifest in the 70th year after Hijrah. However, following the martyrdom of Imam Husayn in 61 AH, this divine plan was postponed to the years 147 to 148 after Hijrah. Imam Sadiq says, "Indeed, God the Mighty and Majestic had set the time for this matter, the rise of the government of Ahl Bayt, in the 70th year after Hijrah. But when Imam Husayn was killed, God's anger at the people of the earth intensified, so he delayed it to 140 years. We informed you of this, but you spread the report and uncovered the veil. After that, God did not set a time for us. God erases what he wills and confirms what he wills, and with him is the mother of the book." This is an example of the notion of bada. If you don't know what bada is, you can look at the footnote in the write-up which explains it. Bada is actually a very important doctrinal concept that we will cover in future sessions, God willing. Now, this postponement was not failure. It was, again, recalibration. It meant that Imam Sajjad's role was not to ignite the final uprising, but to prepare the Ummah intellectually, spiritually, and organizationally for what would come generations later. The seed of Islamic government had to be planted, had to be watered and protected, even if the harvest would be reaped by others. So let us now look at the three aims, the first of which is rebuilding Islamic thought and identity. The first and most fundamental task was to revive the true Islamic worldview, not the corrupted, palace-approved ideology that had spread throughout the Ummah. Generations of propaganda, distortion, and worldly obsession had distanced people from the Quranic principles and the teachings of Ahlul Bayt. The masses had grown accustomed to a version of Islam that legitimized tyranny, that obscured spiritual depth, and reduced religion to rituals without meaning. Therefore, before any political change could occur, the ideological core had to be restored. Imam Sajjad addressed this through the masterwork of Sahifa al-Sajjadiyyah, a book of supplications that is far more than just devotional prayer. It is a curriculum of theology, of ethics, of metaphysics, of social justice, of political insight, and of worship. For example, there is one portion in Du'a 47. Imam Sajjad writes, "O God, make me fear you as though I see you." At a time when sermons could be banned and gatherings spied upon, the Imam taught through the medium of du'a. Sermons disguised as whispers, theology veiled in prostration. He addressed the people. Is there no free man who will leave this leftover of the dogs, meaning the world, to those who deserve it? Surely it is the remnant of the dogs. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was confrontation. A reminder that Islam is not a tool for empire, nor is it a means of social climbing. Rather, it is a ladder to the heavens. His du'as reorientated the soul towards God, reinvigorated Tawheed, the oneness, the unity of God, and Nubuwah, the prophethood, and Ma'ad, the return to God, and planted the foundation for a God-centric polity. The second aim was clarifying divine authority. The second pillar of his mission was to restore the legitimacy of the Ahl al-Bayt in the mind of the public. Generations of political suppression had distorted the perception of their role in the minds of the populace. Entire volumes of forged traditions have been attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, not just to marginalize Ahl al-Bayt, but to slander them. The pulpit was used to curse them. Scholars were paid to obscure their status. Public knowledge of their spiritual and political right to lead was almost erased. This was not merely theological corruption, it was the erasure of divine succession. In response, Imam Sajjad worked to re-educate the Ummah. His letters, his sermons, and interactions reaffirmed that Ahl al-Bayt were the rightful heirs of the Prophet, not only in knowledge and spirituality, but in governance. In the Quran, in Surah Ma'idah, 5th chapter of the Quran, the chapter of the table spread, verse 55, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Your guardian is only God, your wali is only God and his messenger, and those who believe, those who establish the prayer and give charity while they bow down in prayer." We've covered this verse in previous sessions. According to both Sunni and Shia tafasir, exegesis, this verse refers to Imam Ali. Now, by invoking such principles, the Imam was not only offering guidance, he was undermining the legitimacy of the entire Umayyad regime. And the third aim that the Imam had was to rebuild the Shia base. The third aim was the reorganization of the Shia community itself. Karbala, the tragedy of Harra, and the failed uprisings of Mukhtar and the Tawwabun and others had shattered Shia networks. The followers of Ahl al-Bayt were scattered, traumatized, impoverished, and hunted. To sustain the movement of Wilayah, Imam Sajjad had to rebuild grassroots organization, reviving the spirit of the faithful, teaching them privately, building trust, and uniting them beneath a quiet but enduring banner. He worked strategically to educate select individuals, establish networks of communication, preserve the names of trusted companions, and guide the oppressed without exposing them. This underground movement laid the foundations for the educational revolution of Imam Baqir and the formal jurisprudential school of Imam al-Sadiq. But its groundwork was here, in silence, in tears, and in coded sermons. Please give me a salawat and we can continue.
اللهم صل على محمد
محمد
وآل محمد.
So let us now look at the minor tactics to support major goals. Alongside these three primary objectives, Imam Sajjad employed a number of tactical interactions and minor initiatives, each designed to open space in a suffocating political environment. Sometimes these involved engaging with the very tyrants who ruled the land, such as his diplomatic yet strategic interactions with Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, the Umayyad Khalif. At other times, they included exposing and reforming compromised scholars, like Muhammad ibn Shahid al-Zuhri, once a student of the Imam who was later seduced by courtly favor. Please give me a salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
The Imam's famous letter to Zuhri, which, as I've mentioned earlier, is preserved in Tuhaf al-Uqul, is a public rebuke of complicity with injustice. These smaller acts may seem trivial, but in the climate of fear, even a sentence of truth could shatter the regime's illusion of legitimacy. In Quran, in Surah Muhammad, the chapter of Prophet Muhammad, 47th chapter of the Quran, verse number 29, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, "Do those with diseased hearts think that God will not expose their hatred?" These engagements were not capitulations. They were calculated openings, windows to let some air into a tightly sealed room. And slowly, the room began to breathe again. Now, the Imam's actions, whether through subtle advice, moral exhortation, or interactions with compromised scholars, were ultimately geared towards breaking the stagnation of the Ummah. The social environment was choked by fear, corruption, and despondency. His sermons and teachings often took on a Majlis-like form, part sermon, part counsel, part awakening. He did not lecture openly on political theory. Instead, he spoke of the soul, of moral obligation, of spiritual accountability. But within these themes, he planted the seeds of divine authority, the seeds of social justice, and the need for truthful leadership. When someone reads his expositions with an informed lens, it becomes clear. Every utterance was part of a divine strategy. Imam Sajjad was preparing the path, but without premature action. The Imam never believed that the Islamic government could be re-established during his own lifetime. He was aware, both through divine inspiration and political clarity, that the time had not yet come. Oppression was too entrenched and the people too fragmented. His role, therefore, was not to revolt, but to prepare. He laid the foundations upon which the next generations, particularly Imam al-Baqir and Imam Sadiq, would build. And even they, at least during their early years, would not consider the overt establishment of a government. Instead, they would continue the project of intellectual, spiritual, and social revival. In Quran, in Surah Al-Imran, the third chapter of the Quran, the chapter of the family of Imran, verse 140, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, "These are days which we alternate among the people." The Imam understood that his role was not to force the divine plan ahead of its appointed hour, but to ensure that when it came, the people would be ready. Sermons and supplications, a veiled revolution. Now, because of the oppressive conditions Imam Sajjad lived in, he could not teach openly or elaborate on his thoughts directly. Therefore, he resorted to two primary methods of communication. Supplications, which have been preserved in Sahifa Sajjadiyyah, and sermons and expositions transmitted through companions and scholars. The tone of these works was pastoral, devotional, and advisory, but beneath the surface, They were transformative. They rekindled the connection between the soul and its creator, reintroduced the language of true Islamic governance, and prepared the Ummah for an eventual reawakening. His du'as are not generic invocations. They are spiritually encoded doctrines. His sermons are not soft moralizing. They are divine blueprints for societal healing. This style, indirect yet powerful, reflects extraordinary foresight. In a time when a wrong word could cost lives, he used language as sanctuary and prayer as proclamation. For example, in du'a 20 of Sahifa Sajjadiyyah, Imam Sajjad says, "O God, make me love you, love those who love you, and love every action that brings me nearer to your nearness, and make your love more beloved to me than cool water to the intensely thirsty." The Imam's legacy was building a bridge to the future. Now, with this foundation in place, we can now turn to the Imam's actual sayings, expositions, and historical actions, all of which must be read in the light of the threefold strategy: reviving authentic Islamic ideology, clarifying rightful divine leadership, and rebuilding the Shia network for future transformation. Every du'a, every letter, every sermon must be understood as part of this divine architecture. Without this context, one may misread the Imam's words as merely pious lamentation. With context, one sees that they were constructing the pillars of God's awaited order. Now, this is an important note before we continue. Before we begin analyzing these sayings in detail, let us note once more, the Imam lived under conditions of severe restriction. He could not articulate his political program openly. Therefore, his thoughts were clothed in the language of supplication and moral instruction. But to the discerning heart, one that is attuned to the mission of the Imams, it is clear. Every word he spoke was purposeful. Every counsel was strategic. Every whisper was a thunder. We now proceed to examine those sayings, not as isolated spiritual aphorisms, but as a window into the strategic, spiritual, and revolutionary mind of Imam Sajjad, peace and blessings be upon him. So if I can get a loud salawat, we can start looking at the expressions of Imam Sajjad as the epiphany point of political struggle and combat.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم.
So the first point is the Imam's expositions as a framework for resistance. We now turn our gaze towards the luminous expositions of Imam Ali ibn al-Husayn Zayn al-Abidin, peace and blessings be upon him, preserved in sources such as Tuhaf al-Uqul. These discourses, while delivered in diverse styles and to varied audiences, serve as a deep reservoir of both theological awakening and political resistance. In them, we find not merely moral counsel or personal supplications, but rather the articulation of a deliberate and strategic struggle, one rooted in Quranic revivalism, socio-political consciousness, and preparation for a future Islamic order. First of all, we look at the public discourses, reawakening the masses through Quranic reminders. One of the most prominent sermons from the Imam is delivered to the general Muslim populace. The tone, the structure, and content indicate that it was not meant for his close companions or elite followers, but for the broader society. This is evident from the way it begins, not with, "O you who believe," but with the universal address, "O people, ya ayyuhan nas." The Imam in his address anchors his message in the Holy Quran, not merely quoting verses, but weaving them subtly into his speech, thus grounding every exhortation in divine authority. Over 50 verses of the Quran are either directly cited or alluded to. This is a masterstroke of pedagogy. The people did not necessarily recognize him as their Imam due to the prevailing propaganda and historical conditions, but they could not refute the Book of God. He began with words that awaken the soul. Be mindful of God and know that you shall return to him. Of course, this is a direct reminder of Surah Al-Baqarah, the chapter of the cow, second chapter of Quran, verse 156, which reads, Indeed, we belong to God, and to him we shall return. He was reviving forgotten pillars of faith. Rather than offering theological debate, the Imam seeks to revive what the people had forgotten. This approach is not one of instruction, but of sacred remembrance, tadhkirah. He reminds the people of the questions that await every soul in the grave. One will be questioned about his Lord, whom he worshipped, and about his prophet, who was sent to him, and about the religion he professed, and about the book he recited in the night. And crucially, the Imam adds, and about the Imam whose leadership he accepted. This is a subtle but decisive political intervention. At a time when Banu Umayyah were seen as the leaders of the faithful, Imam Zayn al-Abidin places the question of who truly deserves to be followed at the heart of accountability in the hereafter. The term Imam here is not merely spiritual, rather it is civilizational, as the Quran declares in Surah Anbiya, the chapter of the Prophets, 21st chapter of the Quran, verse number 73. And we made them Imams, guiding by our command. Reclaiming the Imamah as political authority. The Imam reclaimed the meaning of Imamah from the distortion it had suffered. In public perception, the ruler, even a corrupt one like Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, was referred to as Imam. This linguistic appropriation had severed the organic link between rightful guidance and political sovereignty. To counter this, Imam Zayn al-Abidin linked Imamah directly to the succession of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his family, insisting that an Imam is the divinely mandated leader, both spiritually and politically. As Imam Baqir has said, and verily the messenger of God was an Imam. Thus, to speak of Imamah is to speak of the right to govern in the name of God. The reminder versus the teacher. This initial exposition demonstrates a powerful insight. The Imam was not primarily a teacher in this address. He was a reminder, a dhakir. He did not engage in complex philosophical or theological debates. There was no need, not yet. The people still remembered the Prophet. They had lived through the time of the Khulafa al-Rashidun. They had lived through the time of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali, of Imam Hassan, and Imam Husayn. Peace and blessings be upon them all. Their knowledge of Islam had not been distorted. It had simply been buried under the rubble of worldly ambition. Therefore, Imam Zayn al-Abidin does not correct false doctrine. He revives lost clarity. His was a voice in the fog, calling not to a new ideology, but to the original covenant with God. So let's look at some contextual comparisons. Imam Sadiq and the rise of intellectual deviations. This approach of Imam Sajjad stands in contrast to the time of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, whose discourses often engage in logical deductions and philosophical reasoning. Precisely because by then, atheists, dualists, and deviant theologians had emerged in public teaching spaces, such as the mosques of Medina and Kufa. As one narration records, Imam Sadiq countered the heretic Ibn Abi al-Awja with rational proofs drawn from creation. He who causes a small thing to grow into something great, and makes the strong return to weakness, and brings health after illness, is he not deserving of being recognized as the one? But Imam Sajjad, by contrast, does not debate the existence of God. Rather, he revives the remembrance of God. So let's now look at highlighting the strategic political message. Although his language is veiled, the Imam subtly introduces the concept of governance, Wilayah and Imamah, into even general sermons, by naming the Imam as part of the grave's questioning, and by defining the Imam as the divinely appointed guardian. He plants a theological landmine under the legitimacy of the Umayyads. Were the people ready to understand the full implications? Perhaps not. But they would remember, and memory in times of oppression is resistance. This is how the Imam worked, awakening hearts through indirect speech, nourishing the soul with a hidden fire. If I can now get a salawat, we will look at some focused discourses that are faithful, veiled revolution, and political clarity.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum.
So, in contrast to the earlier public sermons addressed to the masses, Imam Sajjad also delivered intimate, sharply worded discourses to his most loyal followers, the Shia, the committed believers, the ones who stood firm against tyranny. These were people who had suffered at the hands of the Umayyad regime, who bore scars not only on their bodies, but in their hearts. And to them, the Imam spoke very plainly. This second genre of exposition opens differently. No longer does he say, "O people." Now he calls out, "O you who believe, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu." This Quranic phrase, appearing over 80 times in the Quran, is not just a rhetorical shift. It is a declaration of fraternity, of trust, and of intimacy. The Imam speaks to those already aligned with the Ahl al-Bayt. So now let's look at Imam Sajjad's warnings against the regime, the Umayyad regime, where subtlety gives way to sharpness. In these sermons, the Imam begins to denounce the regime more directly. His opening words, and this is all preserved in Tuhaf al-Uqul, are, "May God protect us and you from the deceit of the oppressors, the envy of the jealous, and the brutality of the tyrants." Here the regime is no longer obscured. They are dhalimin, oppressors, jabbarin, tyrants, the exact terms used in the Quran for Pharaoh and Nimrod and the enemies of the prophets. The Imam's message is stark. The world is full of spiritual and material traps. The tyranny of the rulers is not merely physical but ideological. It dulls the senses, deforms priorities, and slowly seduces the soul. The Imam urges his companions not to be seduced by wealth, by power, or by social ease. Again, from Tuhaf al-Uqul, he says, "May God protect us and you from the plots of the oppressors, the envy of the jealous, and the violence of the tyrants. O believers, let not the tyrants and their followers from among those who desire this world, who incline towards it, who are infatuated with it, and who rush toward its withered and perished remains, deceive you." This is the voice of a revolutionary spiritual leader, training his underground community. The Imam sees clearly the danger of integration. That is, of becoming so accustomed to tyranny that one forgets the very meaning of justice. In the Quran, Pharaoh also tempted the people. In Quran, in Surah Al-Zukhruf, the chapter of the ornaments, 43rd chapter of the Quran, verse 51, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "And Pharaoh proclaimed to his people, saying, O my people, do not the kingdom of Egypt and these rivers that run at my feet belong to me? Do you not perceive?" So too did Abd al-Malik entice the Muslims of his time with the trappings of power. But the Imam, like Musa, like Moses before him, called them back, unmasking the regime and linking power with Satan. In an extraordinary move, Imam Sajjad places the Umayyad rulers on a par with the devil himself. He says, Among the trials you face day and night are the darkness of tyranny, the innovations of heresy, the norms of injustice, the tribulations of time, the fear of authority, and the whisperings of Satan. This is not only eloquent rhetoric, it is revolutionary psychology. He is telling his followers that submitting to the regime is tantamount to listening to Satan. The Umayyad Khalif is not simply an unjust politician. He is a spiritual saboteur, calling for separation, ethical and social disassociation. In a daring and radical statement, the Imam commands his followers to sever association from those tainted by allegiance to the oppressors. He says, "Beware of sitting with the wicked and assisting the oppressors and associating with the wicked. Beware of their trials and keep away from their circles." This is a command to resist, not only with the tongue and the heart, but with social withdrawal. The same way that Prophet Ibrahim, peace and blessings be upon him, declared, again in Surah Al-Zukhruf of the Quran, 43rd chapter, the chapter of the ornaments, verse 26. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and he quotes from Ibrahim, saying, "Indeed, I disassociate myself from that which you worship." So now we look at political memory as resistance, Ashura and the past atrocities. The Imam evokes memory, not merely as nostalgia, but as a tool of resistance. He recalls the afflictions of the Ahl al-Bayt and their followers, the tragedy of Karbala, the martyrdoms of Hujr ibn Adi and Rashid ibn Hajari, the endless persecution of those loyal to the family of the Prophet. He asks, "Do you not remember how severe the trials and afflictions were?" By remembering these crimes, he prevents normalization. His aim is not grief for its own sake. It is to keep the flame of resistance alive. Absolute obedience to divine authority. The Imam culminates these teachings in an unequivocal demand for tawalli, loyalty, to divine authority, and tabarri, disassociation from illegitimate rule. He says, "Give precedence to the command of God, his obedience and the obedience of those whose obedience God has made obligatory, before all matters." Here the Imam establishes the theological legitimacy of the Ahlul Bayt's rule, not as one political party amongst others, but as the divinely ordained stewards of Islam. A political asceticism, disassociation as a revolutionary tool. In a third style of exposition, the Imam adopts the voice of a spiritual ascetic. But the asceticism, zuhud, he preaches is not mere withdrawal, it is political. He says, "Among the signs of those detached from the world is that they sever ties from those whose aims differ from theirs." This was not an abstract ideal. It was a call to form a distinct community, one whose values, vision, and leadership were aligned with divine governance. Please give me a salawat and we look at Risalat al-Huquq, building the infrastructure of a future Islamic order.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Another text of paramount importance is Risalat al-Huquq, the Treatise of Rights. In it, the Imam outlines the rights of every entity, God, the Prophet, the Imams, one's limbs, one's neighbors, family, rulers, subjects, etc. Although delivered in the soft tone of advice, the political content is profound. He is outlining the ethical infrastructure for a just Islamic order, not for his own time, but for a future society that will rise from the ashes. The right of your Imam is that you should know he is your pillar, your guide, and the authority through whom God protects you. Though often categorized under personal or ethical writings, this document forms a constitutional vision for a just society, a model of governance rooted in the sanctity of divine rights and the dignity of human beings. In this treatise, the Imam details over 50 mutual rights, beginning with the rights of God, the self, and bodily faculties, and continuing through the rights of relatives, neighbors, rulers, the ruled, seekers of knowledge, and even enemies. While the tone is calm and devoid of overt political confrontation, the content clearly maps the moral infrastructure for an Islamic society, one guided by justice, adl, accountability, hisbah, and sacred trust, amanah. When Imam Sajjad outlines the right of the leader over the ruled as being the protection of their dignity, equity in judgment, and the provision of counsel, he is explicitly contrasting this divine ideal with the tyranny of the Umayyads, who trampled such rights for worldly gain. Conversely, the right of the ruled over the leader is framed in terms of loyalty, sincere advice, and prayer for the leader's success when the leader walks the path of righteousness. This treatise therefore functions not only as a spiritual charter, but as a manifesto for Islamic governance, grounded in servitude to God and respect for His creation. Let us now look at Sahifa Sajjadiyyah, supplication as subversion. Please give me a salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
The Imam's final and perhaps most powerful weapon was du'a. In Sahifa Sajjadiyyah, he enshrined the language of resistance within the cloak of devotion. With the rhythm of prayer, he pierced through apathy and awakened the soul. For example, in Du'a 11, he says, O God, bless Muhammad and his family, and conclude our lives with happiness, and do not take away from us the good you have given us, and open for us the door of repentance and mercy, and make good the outcome of all our affairs. What sounds like a private plea is in reality a public battle cry. This is not mere rhetoric, it is a spiritual roadmap, reminding the faithful that every decision, every policy and inclination must be measured against the divine scale. Through du'a, Imam Sajjad subtly reshapes the moral compass of society. Where tyrants drowned the public in pomp and spectacle, the Imam offered tearful invocations under the night sky. Where the rulers enforced allegiance through coin and sword, the Imam infused conviction through whispered supplication. In this way, he recentered the Ummah's sense of purpose, away from the palaces of Damascus and towards the throne of God. Indeed, if one were to trace the soft revolution that revived Shia thought after the trauma of Karbala, Sahifa Sajjadiyyah stands at its theological core, stirring the conscience, healing the broken, and inspiring resistance through inward transformation. Every supplication is a call to reorder society, to return the world to the axis of divine justice, reclaiming dignity from the dog's leftovers. The Imam also confronted scholars and elites who had sold their souls for position under the Umayyads. To them he said, "Is there no free man to leave these leftovers of the dogs to their people?" These leftovers, the wealth, palace life, and favor of the court, were scraps. True men of honor would never debase themselves for them. Poetry and protest. Imam Zayn al-Abidin also used poetry, concise, piercing, and potent, to denounce the materialism and moral decay of the regime. These verses were circulated privately, protecting the truth like sparks hidden beneath ash. So now we come to a point where we can say a quiet thunder, rethinking the image of Imam Sajjad. This entire analysis compels us to shed the false image of Imam Sajjad, peace and blessings be upon him. This false image where he is merely a passive, a sickly figure, confined to prayer mats and hidden weeping. He was not merely a survivor of Karbala. He was the architect of the revival. He crafted a theological language that would nourish generations. He reminded the people of their principles, responsibilities, and worth. He protected the memory of the martyrs not through militancy, but through moral clarity. And he did all of this under the eyes of the oppressors without ever compromising the truth. His companions were trained, his community was reawakened, and his legacy, sealed in ink, tears, and flame, laid the groundwork for the Imams who followed. Let no one say he was silent, because his silence was louder than swords. Let us now move on to the tactics behind the third phase of the Imams' revolutionary movement, but if I can get a very loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
اللهم صل على محمد
اللهم
وآل
صل على
محمد
محمد وعلى آل محمد وعجل فرجه.
When examining the life of Imam Sajjad, a noticeable distinction becomes apparent. His methods lack the overt confrontational aggression employed by other Imams, such as Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq or Imam Musa al-Kadhim. This absence, however, was not rooted in timidity or resignation, but in profound strategic insight. To understand this, we must recognize that the third stage of the revolutionary movement of the Imams began with Imam Sajjad. At this formative stage, the fragile community of the Shia, the garden of Wilayah, was still tender. Its roots were just beginning to take hold. It would have been strategically irresponsible to expose this vulnerable group to the ravenous brutality of the Umayyad machine. The Imam therefore adopted the role of a very careful gardener. His mission was not yet to provoke or challenge openly, but to nurture quietly, to water the seeds of conviction, and preserve the continuity of the divine path. And in this, there are strategic parallels with the prophetic era. To comprehend Imam Sajjad's method, one might liken his situation to the early Meccan phase of the prophets, peace and blessings be upon him and his family. In those early years, Islam had not yet gone public, and its nascent community required protection from the hostilities of Quraysh, just as the Prophet concealed certain aspects of his movement to safeguard the believers, so too did Imam Sajjad. The next phase, typified by Imam al-Baqir, mirrors the public Meccan era, a gradual unveiling. The post-Baqir period, culminating in the Abbasid transition, reflects the later Medinian dynamics of mobilization and resistance. Had Imam Sajjad prematurely employed the open aggression seen in the time of Imam Sadiq or Imam al-Rida, the mighty claws of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, then at the height of his power, would have effortlessly crushed the revivalist current. The Imams never acted out of emotion. Never acted out of emotion. Their actions were rooted in wisdom and calibrated to the demands of the time. Yet despite this guarded approach, one still discerns subtle but potent indictments of the regime embedded within Imam Sajjad's sermons, his writings and correspondence, particularly in his later life. Please give me a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So, unmasking the tyrants through theological subtlety. One of the Imam's most eloquent critiques of the regime is found in a narration where he exposes the intellectual manipulation of the Umayyads. He says, "The Banu Umayyah opened the doors for people to learn about faith, but they forbade them from learning about shirk, so that when they imposed it upon them, the people would not recognize it." Shirk, of course, being polytheism. This is a profound indictment. The Umayyads allowed discussions on ritual prayer, on Hajj, on fasting, and even belief in God and the Prophet to a degree. Yet they silenced any discourse on the essence of Tawheed and its opposite, political and theological shirk. Why? Because if people were taught the true nature of shirk, of polytheism, they would immediately recognize the regime itself as an embodiment of it. To recognize Abdul Malik ibn Marwan or his ilk as a rightful ruler was, in the view of Imam Sajjad, an act of theological compromise, an allegiance to Taghut. Shirk and the false caliphate, the verdict of the ulama. The late Allama Majlisi, may God sanctify his soul, the compiler of Bihar al-Anwar, articulates his truth, or this truth, powerfully in his magnum opus, Bihar al-Anwar. Quoting from Imam al-Sadiq, he says, "The verses of shirk, polytheism, outwardly refer to idols, but inwardly they refer to the unjust caliphs who set themselves up alongside the true imams. Such rulers were not merely political usurpers. They were theological threats. By inserting themselves into the position of divinely mandated leadership, they hijacked the place of the imams, and in doing so, challenged the very oneness of God in governance." Letters of defiance. Imam Sajjad's written resistance. The Imam's resistance was not confined to abstract statements. Even in his personal correspondences, we find piercing critiques of the ruling elite. And there's a couple of examples I'd like to share with you. The first one is the marriage to a freed slave woman. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan once wrote to rebuke Imam Sajjad for marrying a woman who had previously been a slave under his ownership, as in under Abdul Malik's ownership. This criticism was veiled in arrogance and surveillance. The Imam responded, "There is no blame upon a Muslim. The blame lies upon the people of Jahiliyyah." In a single sentence, the Imam flipped the accusation, implying that Abdul Malik was the inheritor of pre-Islamic ignorance. The Imam had acted in the way of the Prophet, honoring the oppressed. It was the Khalif, steeped in pride and tribalism, who exposed his own lineage of ignorance. Even the Khalif's own son understood, his name was Sulaiman, understood the gravity of the Imam's words. He turned to his father and exclaimed, "Look how Ali ibn al-Husayn has boasted over you." To which Abdul Malik ibn Marwan somberly replied, "This is the speech of Banu Hashim. It cracks stone." The second is a letter regarding the sword of the Prophet. In another letter, Abdul Malik demanded that Imam Sajjad relinquish possession of the Prophet's sword, an artifact that carried both historical and symbolic authority. The Khalif even offered to fulfill any wish the Imam might have in exchange. The Imam refused. The Khalif then threatened to cut off the Imam's share from the public treasury, from the Bayt al-Mal. The Imam responded, "God provides for his friends from where they do not expect, and God does not love every treacherous, ungrateful one." It was very clear who this was aimed at. Imam Sajjad never considered himself treacherous or ungrateful, nor did anyone else. His subtle implication was that the Khalif himself was both. Now let us look at the poetry of defiance, Farazdaq and the public declaration of value. And this is truly a very beautiful event. While the Imam himself rarely composed extended poetry, the poetry written about him by his companions became weapons of spiritual resistance. One of the most famous moments came from the poet Farazdaq. And if you want to know more about Farazdaq, again, please look at the write-up. There is information about him in the footnotes. During the Hajj season, Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, before ascending the Khilafat, attempted to go and touch the black stone. But the crowd refused to yield to him. Moments later, Imam Ali ibn Husayn entered the great sanctuary, the Haram. Soon as he entered, the masses parted reverently, making way for him. He went straight to the black stone with ease. Angered and humiliated, Hisham pretended to not know who Imam Sajjad was. At that moment, Farazdak, moved by the indignation, stood up and recited verses that have become immortal. Said, "This is the one whose footsteps are known by the sands of Batha. The house Kaaba, the sanctuary, and the sacred precincts all know him." And if you want to know more about this, again, please go to the write-up. You can look at footnote 67. Farazdaq's poem or qasida went on to praise the Imam as the inheritor of prophecy, the refuge of the seekers, and the embodiment of nobility. Each line was like a sword against the Umayyads, affirming that true leadership did not lie in thrones, but in divine inheritance. Hisham, furious, imprisoned Farazdaq, but the Imam, out of gratitude, sent him a reward. Now this is beautiful. Farazdaq refused, saying, "I did it for the sake of God and the honor of Ahlul Bayt. I do not accept payment." This poetry became a form of public tabyin, clarification. Through it, the people remembered who the true leaders were, not the sons of tyrants, but the sons of Sayyidah Fatima al-Zahra and Imam Ali. You have another example, the shouts from Kufa, Yahya ibn Salama. Another companion of the Imam, Yahya ibn Salama al-Tawil, who is different to Yahya ibn Tamil that we've spoken about before, expressed his loyalty and defiance without poetry, but with public cries. He would enter the streets of Kufa and proclaim, "O people, O you who follow the Umayyads, we disavow you. We do not accept you until you believe in God." His message was simple but explosive. He identified the Umayyad regime and its followers as polytheists, directly invoking Quranic rhetoric. It was no minor act of resistance. It was theological warfare waged on the streets. Tactics that are shaped by wisdom. In all of these expressions, the sermons, the sharp letters, the Quranic allusions, the supportive poetry, the cries of the loyalists, Imam Sajjad pursued the same goal: to preserve, to cultivate, and to ready the Ummah for the time when open confrontation would be possible. He did not plant in sunlight, he planted in shadow. And like the Prophet in the early days of Mecca, he prepared the soil of the hearts so that the seeds of divine authority could take root, even in the darkness of oppression. Please give me a salawat and we look at the fierce stance of Imam Sajjad against the official scholars.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
And this is something that every scholar, myself included, needs to reflect on very, very deeply. If someone is in a position to educate people, they need to listen to what Imam Sajjad is saying and introspect. We now arrive at one of the most critical elements of his revolutionary mission: his confrontation with the regime-aligned religious class. These were the so-called scholars and narrators who, rather than defending divine truth, chose to justify falsehood, accommodate tyranny, and sell their silence or speech to the highest bidder. Though Imam Sajjad is often remembered for his patience, his worship, and his du'a, it is imperative not to let this overshadow the steely resolve with which he confronted falsehood and resisted the ideological machinery of the Umayyad state. Over the course of his 35-year imamate, he quietly but effectively prepared the soil for a future Islamic awakening, an awakening grounded in authentic belief, free from distortion, and guided by the rightful heirs of prophethood. At the heart of any Islamic society lies its intellectual compass, its scholars, its narrators, its judges, its poets, and its commentators. When this compass is corrupted, the people lose direction. Thus, the regime sought to manipulate the people's faith by co-opting the scholars and turning the religious narrative to serve the Caliph's throne. This subtle but deadly campaign was one of the most sinister tools in the arsenal of the Umayyads and later the Abbasids. Among those who fell into this trap, as I've mentioned earlier on, but we will look at him in more detail now, was Muhammad ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, a man who once studied at the feet of Imam Zayn al-Abidin, but eventually betrayed the Imam's teachings by aligning himself with the Umayyad court. Initially a transmitter of knowledge, az-Zuhri became a conveyor of propaganda, embedding regime interests within religious discourse, and even forging traditions. Imam Sajjad, peace and blessings be upon him, recognized the gravity of this deviation. He knew that the distortion of religion by official scholars would become the biggest obstacle to establishing a truly Islamic government. For what use is power if the ideological foundations of a community are already rotten? Therefore, alongside spiritual formation, he waged an ideological war. One of the most powerful examples of this confrontation is a letter Imam Sajjad wrote to az-Zuhri, preserved in the annals of history with piercing clarity and righteous anger. This letter is a testament to the Imam's refusal to tolerate the betrayal of divine knowledge for the sake of political patronage. The Imam begins, "May God protect you and us from tribulations, and may He have mercy on you and protect you from the fire." Though seemingly gentle, this is not a prayer of affection. It is a very, very sharp rebuke. The Imam is praying that az-Zuhri be saved from the very fire he is walking towards through his compromises and sycophancy. He continues, "You are in such a state that anyone who truly knows you would feel sorry for you." He reminds az-Zuhri that though the world sees him as honored, in reality he is pitiable, ensnared by the allure of power, trapped in the machinery of oppression. Imam Sajjad then exposes the function of az-Zuhri now, that he performs now for the regime. He says, Imam Sajjad says, "You drew close to one who never upheld justice nor repelled falsehood. They took you as a bridge for their injustices, a ladder for their deviations, and a caller to their misguidance." He accuses az-Zuhri of becoming not merely a passive enabler, but an active agent of oppression. He was being used to beautify the crimes of the rulers, to legitimize their authority in the eyes of the masses. And then comes the thunderous indictment. How little they gave you in comparison to what they took from you. The Imam strips away the illusion of privilege. Whatever wealth or titles az-Zuhri gained were dust compared to the truth, dignity, and salvation that he had surrendered. The Quranic indictment on this is very clear. In Quran, in Surah al-Baqarah, chapter of the cow, second chapter of the Quran, verse 283, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, "And do not conceal testimony. Whoever conceals it, his heart is sinful." And again, in Surah Al-Imran, the chapter of the family of Imran, third chapter of the Quran, verse 187, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, "You must make it clear to the people and not conceal it." In abandoning this duty, az-Zuhri betrayed the divine amana of knowledge, divine trust of knowledge. The Imam concludes, "You are the greatest of people in violating that trust and in misleading others by your example." This letter was not merely a private reproach. It was an ideological missile. It became part of Shia heritage, preserved and repeated, a warning to every generation. Beware the scholar who stands with tyrants. Let us now look at the legacy of resistance. Though Imam Sajjad refrained from open rebellion in the military sense, his political resistance was profound and enduring. His chains, borne from Karbala to Kufa to Damascus, did not silence him. Instead, they became emblems of spiritual steadfastness and intellectual rebellion. He cultivated a core of loyal, enlightened followers through the Sahifa Sajjadiyyah, the treaties of rights, the Risalat al-Huquq, and his pointed engagements with false scholars. He built the foundation of a school that would later blossom under his son Imam al-Baqir and his grandson Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. Peace and blessings be upon them all. Despite the relentless pressure, the threats, and surveillance, the Imam never ceased to speak the truth, and this made him feared. The regime resorted to their final tactic. According to reliable narrations, in the year 95 years after Hijrah, under the caliphate of Walid ibn Abdul Malik, the Imam, the Umayyad Khalif, the Imam was poisoned by order of the state, and he was martyred. The one who had once walked in chains now walked into eternity. He was buried in al-Baqi graveyard in Medina, next to his uncle Imam Hassan al-Mushtaba. His voice lives on in every du'a that declares loyalty to truth, and in every scholar who refuses to bow to tyranny. Please give me a salawat and we move to the conclusion.
اللهم صل
اللهم
على
صل على
محمد
محمد
وآل
وآل
محمد.
محمد وعجل.
The silent
صل على
earthquake,
محمد وآل محمد.
the silent earthquake and the seeds of renewal. In reflecting on the life and mission of Imam Zayn al-Abidin, we do not simply encounter a historical figure. Rather, we meet a divine strategist, a wounded witness, and a silent earthquake who shook the foundations of falsehood with quiet insistence. His was not the revolution of the sword, but the revolution of the soul. He rebuilt the shattered spirit of the Ummah after the catastrophe of Karbala. While others saw a captive in chains, the discerning eye sees a general laying the groundwork for the next phase of the divine movement. Through whispered du'a, he reconnected the heart of the believer to its creator. Through his teachings, he exposed the fabrication of the palace scholars. Through his lived dignity, he challenged the legitimacy of tyrants. And through his long patience, he nurtured a core of companions capable of transmitting the legacy of Wilayah forward, untarnished and unafraid. As we have seen, his stand against the likes of Muhammad ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, his relentless clarification of Tawheed and Shirk, and his ideological confrontation with the tools of the Umayyad system mark him not as a retreating mystic, but as a visionary warrior of truth. His battlefield was the intellect, the soul, and the conscience of a broken society. He taught us that sometimes the Imam must roar without raising his voice, and that chains do not bind those whose hearts are anchored in divine mission. And now, as the curtain begins to fall on his era, we turn towards the son of Sajjad, the bearer of deep knowledge, the splitter of divine sciences, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, peace and blessings be upon him. If Imam Sajjad rebuilt the soul of the Ummah, Imam Baqir will illuminate its mind. May God allow us to continue this journey of understanding, and may our hearts be ever open to the teachings of those who carry the divine trust. Please give me a salawat and we finish with a short supplication.
اللهم
اللهم
صل
صل
على
على
محمد
محمد وآل محمد.
محمد.
This is a supplication which is titled "A Supplication at the Threshold of Chains and Light." In his name, the patient avenger, the one who never forgets a tear shed for his sake. O God, send your blessings upon Muhammad and the family of Muhammad, the lanterns in the night of tyranny, the anchors in the storm of sedition, the inheritors of prophecy and the witnesses to betrayal. O God, this is the son of Husayn, the captive of Karbala, the chain-bound Imam, whose voice reached beyond iron and fear. This is the one who spoke when others wept, who prayed when others despaired, who taught when others were silent. O Lord of Sajjad, he was the orphan son of a slaughtered father. He stood alone in the courts of falsehood with no sword in his hand, but with the truth blazing from his tongue and the light of Wilayah veiled in his supplication. O God, we bear witness that he did not bow to the thrones of gold, that he did not trade your truth for their coins, that he did not conceal your message beneath their robes. We bear witness that in every sigh he uttered, the fire of Karbala lived on, that in every supplication the soul of Husayn marched again. He recited your names in the depth of the night, while the world slept, intoxicated by the false caliph's flattery. He taught us that tears can be a sword, that remembrance can be a revolution, that patience is not passivity, but the strongest blow against the idols of power. O God, we ask you by the sanctity of his sujud, by the bleeding of his feet upon the prayer mat, by the dignity he carried even when shackled, to include us among those who love him, who follow him, and uphold his mission. Do not allow us to betray him with our forgetfulness. Do not allow us to claim loyalty while living in hypocrisy. Do not allow our tongues to recite what our limbs fail to embody. O God, as he yearned for the justice that never came in his time, as he planted the seeds for a future not his to witness, as he wrote for generations yet unborn, we are those generations. So by his right, by his chains, and by his supplications, O God, hasten the return of the awaited son of Fatima az-Zahra. O God, raise the banner of justice over this broken world. O God, send the voice that silences oppression, the light that consumes darkness, the face that is veiled for our sins. Let us not die before we see him. Let us not live unless we prepare for him. And if we are not worthy to stand beside him, then make us worthy through your mercy. Write us among his lovers, his servants, his defenders, those who rise when others sleep, who sacrifice when others hesitate, who cry out when others remain silent. O God, by the pain of Zaynab, by the tears of Sajjad, by the blood of Husayn, make us true soldiers of al-Mahdi, and shower your peace upon our master, the chained Imam who never gave up hope, and those who did wrong shall know what their end shall be. Amen, O Lord, sustainer of the universes. Amen, O most merciful of the merciful. Wa akhiru da'wani alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.